So, kia ora everybody. I am Casey Lucas-Quaid, and I am here to tell you all about how I interpreted, developed, furthered, and then wrote the character dialogue in Darkest Dungeon 2. So again, if that's not what you're here for, the doors are now closed, and you're going to learn about it anyway. So, welcome. Before we get started, I just have a little bit of housekeeping. For the record, it shouldn't be a problem because these are nice and weighty, but I do actually have a tremor disorder, so if my hand twitches, someone might win a prize. It might be a black eye, so it's actually possibly for the best that there's no one sitting in the front row. So, I mean, you laugh, but like I've got pretty long arms, so we'll see. I guess I'm going to go ahead and crack into it. There are still some people filtering in, but the beginnings of these things are always just an intro anyway. So, so glad you could join us. Thank you for coming by. All right, well, without further ado, the clicker ain't clicking, mate. All right, there we go. So before we get into the meat and potatoes, I figure I'll just run you guys through a quick introduction. So my name is Casey Lucas-Quaid. You may know me as the Senior Community and Engagement Manager on Mini Metro and Mini Motorways, but I also do a heap of other stuff. I write things under my pen name, Casey Lucas, which is not that much of a secret. It's just that I got published before I got married, so I kept both. I've been in games for 15 years, and I started that 15-year journey as an area designer on Telnet MUDs. Put a hand up if you know what that even is. Sick. I would love to talk to you guys afterwards because that's just a conversation I haven't been able to have in a decade. I did that for about 6 months, then got invited onto that game's narrative team, and eventually started helping out with their community events as well. Along the way, I have also done stints in comics, manga. I was a sport commentator for the New Zealand Winter Games. I did 8 seasons of commentary doing color and match commentary for ice hockey. I've been a best-selling author. I've been a worst-selling author. I have worked on games that sold millions of copies, and I have worked on games that no one ever played. And that's kind of how it is when you work in games long enough. For those who are kind of earlier in your careers, the breadth of experience, the longer you stay in the industry, will astound and sometimes sadden and sometimes terrify you. I've been in New Zealand since 2008, and I moved up here to Wellington to take the job with Dinosaur Polo Club, where I still am. We're still working on Mini Metro, Mini Motorways, and a bunch of stuff that we can't tell you about yet. And while I was doing all that, nope, still not clicking. Pardon? Oh, am I lasering you? Oh, sick. Even better. That? Thank you. All right, so I've been working on and off for the past few years on the sequel to best-selling indie RPG, Darkest Dungeon. So for those of you who don't know, what the hell is Darkest Dungeon? It's an indie game, self-published and self-funded by Red Hook Studios based out of Vancouver in British Columbia. The series currently constitutes 2 games. They both have heavy stylized gothic visuals. They are RPGs with elements of turn-based combat, dungeon crawling, base building. They have a roguelite structure, and they're heavy on roster management. You will notice that my slides are very wordy, and my notes and my slides are basically the same thing. There is actually a reason for that, and that's because when I give my slides to people at the end of a talk like this, I don't want it to just be a bunch of short bullet points that you're not going to be able to extrapolate good data from later on. I want you to be able to use this to actually help you do things, if you want to do the things that I do. So Darkest Dungeon is famous beyond all else for its tone and its aesthetic. It's steeped in this antediluvian narration. It's got this creeping dread and cosmic horror, visuals inspired by everything from board games to medieval woodcuts. Between the two games and their DLCs, they have sold just a smidge over 16 million copies, so not bad. One of the first games to ever kind of make it big on Kickstarter back in 2015, I believe. And the worst part, or the best part, if you're the writer, depending on how you feel on any given day, is that there are 22 playable characters. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna try the click one more time. Nah. I'm just gonna say click. Yeah, I'm just... Ooh, can I laser you? Yes. I feel like that's a little Pavlovian. Are you all right with that? All right. Boop. So my role on the Darkest Dungeon series, initially I was hired to edit the script of Darkest Dungeon 2, and after I did some editing of some character backstories, it was also asked if I could develop a style guide and character profiles, and after I did all that for the localization team, I was eventually invited to help write the game and its DLCs. That is, I cannot overstate what an honor it has been to work on a title like that, especially to be invited to help contribute to the writing when I thought my job was just going to be to, you know, spit shine it and make sure everything was grammatically correct. And one of the most interesting kind of exercises that you have to do when you're working on a project like that is when you're playing a game like Darkest Dungeon, it is evident the amount of care and the amount of thought that has gone into every aspect of it, from its visuals to its writing to its audio. And you can play along and you can take notes, and that is actually a great way to learn to write in a series. But there's always going to be something you're missing, right? Because if you play through an encounter and you win, you don't know what happens when you lose. When you play with one party composition, you don't know what might happen if you were playing with a totally different party. And so the challenge I had before me was, how do I extract the vital character information from a game with such a sprawling and iconic script? Because the goal with the sequel is always to maintain the consistency of tone, both in terms of the narration, the character voice, and then even carrying that through to the marketing copy and the tooltips and the tutorial, because you don't ever want the player to not be immersed. And that is actually something that we've worked on with Mini Motorways as well, in a totally different style, obviously. But we want the map descriptions and the tooltips and the tutorial to be written in the same accessible fashion that the game is known for. And with Darkest Dungeon, it's like that, but it's mean, which is great. And so basically, you try to break down what makes a character's voice unique, what makes the narration unique, by comparing them to other characters, by comparing them to the tone that you want for the sequel versus the tone that already exists for the base game. And then you just take a lot of notes, and in my case, you make a giant spreadsheet, which I will give you a glimpse of later. And over the course of, I believe it was 4.5 years before we entered early access, my goal was to ensure that character profiles, setting notes, the style guide, and all of that were comprehensive enough that if me, my art director, and my assistant art director were all in like one of those weird three-way car crashes that you hear about when you're doing like NCEA maths, someone else needed to be able to pick up the pieces, right? Because in the end, it's a team exercise, and you don't ever want to be so like clingy to your work and so attached to it that you don't leave enough of a footprint that other people can follow if they have to. And that's actually quite easy to do when you already have to document everything that you're doing for yourself, because it's a new game and you might not be acquainted with all of it yet. Laser. And before I get too deep into the specifics of this project, just in case there are people who are a little bit newer to the terminology for this sort of talk and to games writing in general, I'm going to go over some basics. For example, what are character barks? Barks in single-player games are often used to convey a status effect or world information to the player. In addition, they showcase characters' personalities and how characters interact with the world and each other. In multiplayer games, barks can serve a greater purpose. Not only do they convey information to the player controlling the character, but they often stand in for mic communication between players and convey information to the player's squad mates. My favorite example is always Coach yelling, "Cover my ass" in Left 4 Dead, because it's 3 words, it's telling a player what to do, it's another player directly asking for help in a way that doesn't require a clumsy interface, it's characteristic, it's funny, and it gets the job done. 3 words, incredible. Examples of character barks that you can put in your portfolio as a prospective games writer are also a really vital thing to have, because they show anyone that you're applying to work for that you can think about how to convey status information to a player in a variety of different characters' voices. So that showcases versatility. It also helps you tell the story within the story, which is writing smaller snippets of dialogue that showcase character relationships and how individual characters view the greater world in a really short span. And it also shows that you have a holistic view of the project. You're considering a project from the smallest details on up. Like, everyone who wants to be a writer can teach themselves how to write a plot or an outline. Many people applying for entry-level games jobs can write a good plot arc, but populating the individual characters within it with personalities and dialogue that conveys those personalities is thinking at the micro level as well as the macro level, and it'll stand out. So, barks are tied deeply into just the notion of how we speak as people. I want you to take a minute and think about how you yourself talk. Is there anything that anyone has ever told you that stands out about your voice? Or has anyone ever commented when they've heard a recording of you? Has anyone ever asked where your accent is from, in the good way or the racist way? Has anyone ever asked you where you learned a slang term? Think about the influences on the way that you speak and how those influences surface in subtle ways in your everyday dialogue. It can even be things like, do you ramble? Or are you a particularly concise speaker? Do you ask a lot of questions? Or are you more the sort of person who invites questions by making a statement that you know a person can relate to? Do you use slang? Do you cuss? All sorts of those little variables can get built into the way that a character speaks, as well as the way that regular people communicate with each other. So if you jot down the above info for all of your characters, how do you differentiate it when all of your characters grew up in the same place, have the same education, come from the same socioeconomic background? The good thing is, people are different. There are always going to be differences between people. And now that you're developing a rough mental sketch of your characters' voices, think about how those voices will surface over the course of an actual gameplay loop. For example, when your characters talk, what are they doing? And I don't mean like, he's asking a question because he wants to know the answer. We've got that. But what are they actually doing? What is the action that a character's model is performing? What animation are they undergoing when they speak to this other character? Is it in the middle of a battle? Are they walking somewhere together? Are they standing in a supermarket trying to pick out what type of energy drink to buy? The setting and the specific action that a character is undertaking matters a lot to the way that you can phrase that dialogue, because it affects the way that we speak. Like, just think about it. If you have 2 characters who, say, just forded a river, Oregon Trail style, they're gonna be out of breath. They're gonna be wet. They're gonna be sweaty. They're probably gonna be unhappy. They are not going to talk to each other the same way as if they are relaxing by a campfire, having a cup of cowboy coffee. Think about the way that even good relationships between people can grow strained when the setting places characters in a strained situation. So in Darkest Dungeon 2, characters' primary actions are combat, riding in the stagecoach, and relaxing with one another at inns. So you can consider the differences in how a person would talk when they are sitting and sharing a smoke with their comrades versus like actively being stabbed. Laser. And the other thing when you are getting ready to write dialogue in a sequel is that you have to embody someone else's IP. you are kind of stepping into someone else's world, and you are embracing their source material while also hopefully making it your own and building upon it. And I think that the number one thing to consider if you are ever going to be writing for any given IP or in anyone else's universe is, no matter how silly it is and no matter how much you may or may not be a fan of it, just respect the source material. Build on it. IP work sometimes gets a bad or boring rap in the games world, but like, you just gotta have to figure out how to have fun with it. Otherwise, you're gonna be miserable. And if someone does hire you to do it well, even if it's not your thing. I have written for Magic the Gathering in the past. I have written for a Games Workshop. And for both of the projects that I did for Wizards of the Coast, as well as what I did for Games Workshop, I had to work on something that I wasn't super keen on before I eventually got assigned to a thing that I really, really liked. And I did not treat one job or the other with a lesser amount of respect just because I wasn't already a super fan. It helps if you consider the trust that someone is granting you when they invite you to work on their project. It's like someone else is letting you play in their sandbox. They are letting you put the finishing touches on something that they cared enough about to devote like years of their lives to it in some cases. Someone else is letting you make their pigeons kiss. It's just, it's actually a gift, if you think about it, to be trusted that much in the workplace. And sequels in particular, rather than just part of an existing series, are their own beast, because there is an immense pressure on you to not only do the first game that everyone liked again, but to do it better and with a twist and backwards and in heels. And it's exhausting sometimes when you think about the pressure that we as developers put on ourselves, as well as the pressure that the greater community puts on us because they expect the best of us. At GDC this year, Red Hook's founders actually gave an amazing talk about it called Ruin or Redemption, The Making of Darkest Dungeon 2. You can look that up in the GDC vault. It's by Tyler Sigmund and Chris Barassa. I highly, highly recommend it, even if you're not that interested in Darkest Dungeon, although I don't know why you're here if you wouldn't be, so maybe. But it goes into a lot of the pressures and how those pressures can exert themselves on creative decisions. So, character barks in Darkest Dungeon 2. Almost all dialogue in the game is conveyed through barks. As of the time that I initially wrote this slide, I said there were about 6,500 in the game. Now it's more like about 7,000 because we've cracked into another DLC. Barks can serve many purposes in many different aspects of gameplay, as we covered earlier, conveying status info, conveying information that you want the player to know about the world. As I've already said, barks are good to learn how to write if you want to write games professionally. There's a reason why I mentioned that on more than one slide. And also, the reason why I've done this little explainer is that Darkest Dungeon 2 also has a voice-acted narration script, which is technically told from the point of view of a character. So I do include him in my examples of the work that I've done on this title, just to ensure that you guys get a little bit of information about how we managed that in the parallel track of writing the barks as well. In this talk, I will use the word script to refer to both, but it's usually quite obvious which one I'm talking about, because one's voice acted and one's not. All right. So what did I do when I was getting ready to crack into the first game script? The process that you use to analyze a script when you're about to work on a sequel or a game in a series may differ from project to project because every game studio stores and displays their scripts in their own beautiful, unique, and inevitably fucked up way. I have never worked on a game that stores a script the same way as any other game I have ever worked on. It's always new, it's always exciting, and there's always some inevitable file import error where suddenly you will just get like words.txt with no paragraph breaks. Embrace it, it's part of the magic, right? It's also one of the few times when you can get paid to just sit and play a game. Outside of testing, there aren't really many opportunities to do that. So take that first game, play the hell out of it, let yourself lose sometimes, and just take notes as you go. If you have access to the original team, it's very, very good to just be an open book, have that open communication with them. Let them know if you're ever unclear on anything. Let them know if you're ever confused or where you don't know how to access information. Ask them for their inspiration. What got them excited to work on the project? What inspired them to create the thing that you were working on? What were they reading when they got the idea of the game that you're now writing? What were they watching? What music were they listening to? Because you can take that inspiration and kind of build it into your own mental Pinterest board to sort of take their inspiration, but take your own favorite aspects of it as well. And also, when you're taking early notes, one thing that really helped me is making sure to note down what things aren't, as well as what they are. This seems obvious, but if you sit with that question for a moment, one of the things that will occur to you is that you don't often think about the absence of a thing. You don't often think about what something isn't. But when I was contemplating exactly how to crack into Darkest Dungeon 2, one of the things that immediately leapt out at me about the first game is that there's almost no back and forth scripted interaction between the heroes. You have your party of heroes. They are existing in a 4v4 battle setup usually. It's turn-based combat. All of the barks occur within that combat text, or within the camping context, or within the stagecoach travel context. But it's never two people sitting in front of each other speaking back and forth. And when you think about how to tell a story, it's actually really hard to tell a story about a group of people if they never have conversations with each other. How do you convey that they have misunderstandings? How do you convey that they're starting to like each other? How do you convey a growing sense of antipathy, if there is any, if they never look at each other and say, like, God, I'm sick of you? Like, there is none of that in the game. So what you have to do is you have to use the game's existing architecture to build the emotional aspects of what those conversations would usually inspire without those conversations. And that means thinking about the negative space of what the game doesn't have. So I actually made a big list of character interactions that simply don't exist in Darkest Dungeon 1 that I knew probably also wouldn't exist in Darkest Dungeon 2. And that really helped me narrow down what I was going to need to focus on in the parts of the game that do exist, because I knew now the gaps that I would need to wallpaper over, essentially. The cool thing about working in video games is that there is no set way to do anything. That can be daunting at times. It can be a case of feeling like you are constantly having to reinvent the wheel on a team full of people who are busy reinventing their own wheels and do not have time to help you chisel yours. But at the same time, I find it really freeing. The fact that there is no expected order of operations to writing a game script means that you can kind of go your own way with it. And that also means that you don't have to be afraid to seek knowledge in weird places and play with your findings in weird ways. For example, one of the things that I did when I was digging into the script of Darkest Dungeon 1 was I spent a lot of time consulting the fan wiki. And that's kind of a weird one because on one hand, fan wikis aren't necessarily always accurate. And fans can sometimes obsess about aspects of the game that really aren't that important. I'm sure we've all done that with stuff we're fans of. But one thing that is interesting about fan wikis is that it shows you what aspects of the character fans think are the most prominent. And sometimes that is not what you yourself were thinking about when you were contemplating writing that character. One thing that I noticed fans of Darkest Dungeon had initially picked up on was the Highwayman, one of the first characters and probably the ostensibly most popular hero in the game. the fan wiki was really obsessed with this idea that he had a gambling problem, and I wasn't really sure where it came from, because some of his barks do mention that he gambles, but not necessarily in a way that meant he was constantly going bankrupt, or that he had a pathological addiction to it. And eventually, I dug through the entire script. I looked for every single reference to things like cards and gambling and dice and all of that stuff. And the conclusion that I came to is that he mentions gambling a little bit because he's a dirtbag, he's a criminal, that's the crew that he hangs with. And I think people just assumed, he's also poor, that must be why. And that was just sort of an assumption that people made that, to my knowledge, was never documented anywhere. And when I asked the team about it, they had no idea either. So sometimes what you're going to be doing is looking for assumptions that other people have made about the initial work, and you can either choose to lean into them if you think it would be fun, or if other people on the team agree that it would be accurate, or you can just sort of like steer that conversation in another direction because that's not actually how that guy is. So double check for accuracy, but also double check for enthusiasm. Double check for what people want to see more of. That's me kind of thinking with my community manager hat on a little bit, but it's true. It's what you can use to also find things to excite you. Interestingly enough, Red Hook has a policy of avoiding looking at game mods and looking at fan fiction about their games because they want to ensure that their ideas come from their team, and they want to avoid fan creators potentially having their feelings hurt at any sort of perceived issue or perceived theft of ideas. It's not something that I think every studio has, but it is something to be aware of if you are potentially going to be writing for something that you yourself are a fan of. You have to be able to put up that mental wall and make sure that you can work professionally while thinking about stuff that might make you squeal in a fanish way, because that's actually okay. And also the team that you work on might not give a shit about that at all. It varies. One of the things that people always say is a very weird strategy is when I first cracked into Darkest Dungeon 1, what I did for every single character, including the narrator, was I made a copy-paste document of every single line of dialogue they had, and then I put it through a tool that generated big, ugly word clouds. I wanted to see what the words they spoke the most were. I used a script that I put together in Python to delete the most common ones, stuff like I, V, blood, oh no, whatever. And eventually I had this nice little nugget of information that's like, this is what this woman is always yelling about. And that is the essence of what matters to that character. It shows you which characters are thinking about themselves and thinking selfishly versus which ones are making exclamations of alarm at the idea that someone else is suffering. And that's something that I really focused on when I started putting together my big ugly spreadsheet. Laser. All right. The hard truth, if you have never written a video game before, is that many video games solely exist within Microsoft Excel in a series of tabs. I have worked on entire games with staff of like 24 people where the design doc, the map, the script, the task tracking, the links, the file sharing, the who is working on what, all of that shit is just stored in literally something that we called the hell sheet. And sometimes when you opened it, your computer would die. And eventually we realized that the hell sheet need not exist all as one sheet, and we broke it into like 4 separate sub-hell sheets. I need to say this in defense of Red Hook Studios, this was not Darkest Dungeon, this was a completely separate game. They're a little bit more professional than that. They are excellent with their back-end practices, but other games you work on might not be. And getting used to thinking about telling a story within a series of spreadsheets is something that will help you become a better games writer, even if you feel like it is squeezing the soul from your body a little bit. All right, so this is a snippet of one of my spreadsheets covering the voice of the Runaway, who was a new hero in Darkest Dungeon 2. When I was first brought onto the project, she was a fully modeled character. She had her moveset, she had her animations, she was tester ready, she was glorious, and she had no dialogue written for her whatsoever. So after I did my editing pass on the narration, writing her dialogue was my first kind of assignment that I gave myself, because it seemed like a good way to ease into the project after studying all of the existing heroes. Now, the number one lesson that you need to take away from the existence of any spreadsheet that I tell you about or that anyone else tells you about is that what matters is that you need to lay out the information you need in a way that you like. Lay it out in a way that benefits the way that your brain works. Unless you work for a team that is megalomaniacal and control freaky about how you keep notes about your own data, what matters to you about this document is that you be able to open it, look at it, and learn from it. You're going to be creating it for yourself, potentially other people on the team, but first and foremost, it just needs to be information accessible to you the way that tickles your particular brain. Now, I preface this by saying there are 10,000 questions you could put in this, and ultimately the questions that you ask yourself about your characters should be relevant to your particular project. Not every game has the same character issues and the same character values and the same character conflicts as Darkest Dungeon, and that's fine. There are an infinite permutation of games out there, and whatever game you are working on and whatever characters you are writing, they will have their own essence and they will have their own spirit and they will have their own wounds and they will have their own friendships. And what matters is somehow distilling the vast complexity of a human being into a series of yes-no questions that will gradually arise the more you think about a project. So one thing when you are getting ready to start writing characters with different voices and writing profiles for those characters is you need to think about the attributes that set your characters apart from one another. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got about games writing is actually something someone told me in a commercial review of a game that I worked on. And it's not often that you get good advice there, because often it is very mean, even if the game that you worked on was well liked, because it's just, that's the world we live in, man. But someone left a comment underneath the Red Hook Twitter account when they made a post about Darkest Dungeon 2, where someone said, "I love the barks when the characters are on the stagecoach, because even if my screen was completely black and I couldn't see who was speaking, I can always tell who it is." And that is the nicest thing anyone has ever said about anything that I have ever made, including like my own mother. That is an astounding compliment, knowing that you have managed to create characters with distinct enough voices and written about them in a way that people have latched onto them to that extent. And so now that is what I keep in mind when I am working with ensemble casts. So what sets characters apart? There's a lot of really basic shit. Stuff like, what gender are they? What gender do they want to be? Where were they born? Where do they live now? Are they happy where they are now? Do they want to go back to where they're from? Are they young? Are they old? Do they resent the fact that they're getting old? Are they glad they made it to the age they are? You can ask an infinite number of questions in that regard. And again, what matters is what's important to your story. Then you can get into the types of demographics that are a little bit deeper, a little bit testier, a little bit more contentious. You can look at things like education level, religion, socioeconomics. You can look at things like whether or not they are irreverent, whether or not they are horny. You can look at the key themes of your game and how individual characters respond to them. And also, how does that response change over the course of your story? Because ideally, these characters, when they set out in the first scene that you write for them, will not be the same people at the final curtain call. You can also get into what characters value. And that can be a little bit abstract when you think about it as a single question, but it's kind of easy to break it down when you think about it in terms of how that would be conveyed in dialogue. Do they value their self, or do they value other people? Are they the sort of person that will always start a sentence with I? Are they the sort of person that wants to talk about themselves, even if they are in a conversation where that's not particularly relevant? Are they anti-authoritarian, or are they glad to be able to call in the cops or the army or whatever authoritarian group might exist within your setting? Are they afraid to die, or are they secretly kind of glad? Are they from a culture where dying in battle is kick-ass? There are so many ways to approach the sort of scenarios your characters will find themselves in a game, and you just put all that in the spreadsheet. If it's relevant to you, you literally just create a line and put it in your spreadsheet, and then you just do that for every character. And when you get to a point in your story where an event that value comes up against is occurring, you can just reference that spreadsheet and say, oh, okay, if push came to shove, this guy would sell out every single other person in this party to save his own skin. And you can just take that and run with it. And that's when you think about what I mentioned earlier with the actions your characters will specifically be performing in the game. Do they like these actions they're performing? Is this a job for them that they are just happy to get over and done with? Are they stone cold professionals? Do they hate the fact that they are there on this journey with these people? Do they love it? Do they feel like it's an opportunity for building relationships and community? Are they in it for the money or for the love of the game? You know what? These all just kind of sound like Tinder profiles, don't they? But there is a reason for that. Dating apps are a blight upon society, but I do not think there is a single technological invention that has ever better nailed the concept of delivering bite-sized, extremely relevant chunks of information about people to a shitload of other people in an easy-to-digest layout. Dating apps are literally just, boom, here's a list of demographics about this person, and yeah, they could be a lie, but it doesn't matter if you're writing a story about the guy instead of dating him in real life. The point for that is take inspiration from anywhere in the real world that you choose, not just the first game or the other games in your series. And once you have built your matrix, you can use it to develop voices from scratch for brand new characters. When I first joined Darkest Dungeon 2, the Runaway didn't have any lines of dialogue, as I've already mentioned. I used this script analysis method to craft a voice for her. I wanted her to be furtive. I wanted her to be anxious. I wanted her to be constantly feeling the need to keep moving, but also scrappy. She was a street kid. She's grown up, and now she is ready to throw down. Later on, I worked alongside the art director to craft the voice of the duelist in the Binding Blade DLC. She is exacting, she is vicious, she is French as fuck. And due to spoiler reasons, we also significantly reworked the voice for the Crusader. If you haven't played Darkest Dungeon 2, I won't mention anything further there. We've also got a new hero coming up in the upcoming Kingdoms DLC, and again, all of the information on that spreadsheet was how I made sure that the voice for these new characters didn't step on the toes of any of the existing ones. So, I mentioned there's a narrator. Yes, he's also a character. In fact, he's the first character that people encounter when they play Darkest Dungeon. What do you think, what's the first thing that comes to mind after you see that first game's splash scene? It's literally just that guy going, "Ruin has come to our family." And like, I had to follow that up. Like, damn. But the good news is you can write a profile for your voiceover narrator just like they're a character. Include the same information that you gave your characters: culture, education, demographics, level, relation, like their relation to the player. Is the narrator an antagonistic force? Are they someone who is swooping in to give the player hints and tooltips to help them along their journey? You can develop all of that with the narrator just like you've done it for the cast. And when you're writing a script that is meant to be acted or read out loud, you're likely going to receive a lot of information from your creative director on how best to format your lines and how best to work within that particular medium anyway. So you're going to be a little bit less alone, for that part at least. that brings me to the end of my, I don't know, I feel like basically what I did was I knocked on your door like a Mormon and told you to not be afraid of Microsoft Excel. But, you know, if it helps you get a job, great. Or if it got you a laugh, great. Or if you just learned a little bit about a game that you like, also great. We've got some time for questions, I believe, probably about, what do you think, like 5 minutes? Cool. So we've got another mic that can circulate around through the room, and pop your hand up if you have a question.
What if someone super disagrees with your vision of a character?
It depends on who that someone is. Are they your boss?
Your boss.
If it's your boss, you have to do what they say. Okay. That is generally the rule when you sign an employment contract. But also, when I have creative disagreements with other people on teams that I work with, what is important to me is getting to the root of why they feel the way they do and hearing their justifications. Because if it's not just a snap judgment, like, I don't think he'd talk like that, then what matters is actually hearing why. Because these are people who may be more familiar with the source material than you, or they may have a different idea for something that can occur further on in the game that will then make that character moment make sense. It's never been a question of, oh, well, I feel one way and, you know, like my boss feels the other way. It's very frequently, when those disagreements occur, just a case of crossed wires or you not having access to the same information that they have. And I very, very rarely have ended up in situations where there's been a total creative disagreement where I didn't eventually go, oh, okay, you know what, that makes sense.
Cool, thank you.
Sorry, can I just get through here? Thank you. Sorry. All good. When you're writing, I guess, are you like a listening to music person or podcasts, or do you sit there in like perfect silence thinking about it?
That's an interesting one for me because I love to listen to podcasts and I love to listen to music, but I find that if I'm ever listening to something with lyrics or other people talking, it impacts my ability to really get inside a character's voice. And so I will frequently listen to stuff like movie soundtracks or post-rock or stuff that doesn't have any lyrics. The album that I have written the most to is probably an album called Hobart by a sludgy noise band called Lustmord. It's great for Darkest Dungeon. I don't know if it's great for writing much else. It really just depends on what you vibe with. But yeah, it's very, very tough for me to listen to anything with words when I'm writing.
A quick follow-up. Did you listen to any of the Darkest Dungeon soundtrack when you were writing Darkest Dungeon?
Oh, yeah. Stuart Chatwood is a genius. Yeah.
So my question is about like the turning point in a project when you stop making it more granular and complicated and start writing. Because I always kind of blow way past that point, and because I'm so excited about finding things and then building detail and building context. So I want to know how you spot the moment when it's like, okay, stop making this more complex, stop adding more rows to the spreadsheet and just start writing dialogue.
Deadlines. It's always just, I got to do it because it's got to get done. But if I'm talking a self-directed project, then such a cop-out answer. I just give myself a deadline because ultimately you can noodle away at the inner labyrinth of a world that you are creating forever. It's just that at some point the level of detail that you get to will no longer add anything of substance to the actual story. So I try to think of it in terms of like, what is the most relevant to the gameplay and what is the most relevant to the story beats that I know the gameplay will cover. Like, one of the big things that occurs when a player plays through Darkest Dungeon 2 is you encounter a series of boss battles. The series of boss battles are based on negative emotions, and during those boss battles, the characters will experience the negative emotions that these bosses embody. And so if I know that the characters are heading toward a journey where they are going to be staring down a boss whose whole thing is making them face their worst inner conceptions of themselves and the things that they are afraid that other people think about them, then that is where I would start. I would think, okay, what is important to this guy? What does it matter to him to be seen as? If people see him otherwise, how does that make him feel? And eventually you get to a point where you are working on details that aren't relevant to that boss encounter anymore.
Can you give us just like the quickest TLDR on the like briefing document you were given by the creative director when you stepped onto the project? Like this, what the storyline briefing that you were given, like how much, I guess, room to move you had there?
This is not a condemnation of Red Hook Studios, but there was no document. It was just a couple phone calls.
Good to know.
Let's say you have characters that are very similar and you're kind of stuck on how to change the characters to be unique. What do you start on? Like, what do you change first?
Oh, that's a great question. For me, it would depend on why they're similar. Like, are they similar because they are siblings, so they grew up in the same place and they have the same relatives and the same education and the same socioeconomic background? In that case, what is it about siblings that always makes them fight? It's often things like, I hate it when people can't talk about me without mentioning my sister. And what you do is you need to find a single point of contention between these two characters and figure out whether or not that point of contention would make them like each other or dislike each other. And then this is a character writing exercise that I frequently do to kind of get myself in a character's head, is I imagine that character in an imaginary argument with this other person, and they get to the point of where they're throwing insults at each other. And like, what are the things that they insult about each other the most? Because that's very frequently the differences that people have between them. And if you are writing two characters that are very similar, but didn't grow up in the same place, and aren't related to each other in any way, then if you're in a position within the project and the company that you work for to be able to make these changes or ask these questions, I would actually just ask my director why they're so similar. Because ultimately, that is something that someone designed, and if they designed it for a reason, they can share those reasons with you. And if they simply weren't thinking and accidentally created two borderline identical dudes, then you can actually talk to the design team and be like, I think this is going to be a problem because nobody's going to be able to tell these two apart.
Thank you.
What was your favorite voice to do?
Oh, that is such a good question because like, I haven't really said it enough in the talk, but I have loved writing for this game so much. It has been such a joy for me. It has been such an enriching professional experience. I personally love writing the Plague Doctor because she's just got such a strong personality, and she is a very atypical woman in video games, which I love. She's a weird little freak, which I also love. And within the time period where the game is set, I love being able to play with all of the weird pseudoscience and alchemy bullshit that she 100% thinks is like the true science according to like the laws of the world. I also really loved writing the Flagellant because he's just so weird. I love characters that are bizarre and aggressive, and I love the Flagellant because he reacts to game events almost always in the exact opposite way that other characters do. So like when other people get like stabbed and they're bleeding, they're like, oh no, I'm bleeding. Or like, fuck, give me a bandage. The Flagellant's like, ha, more. And it's just, that juxtaposition is a lot of fun to write. I think there was one more question up here in the front. Or, yeah.
Aside from being able to write all of the sort of like, the barks and the voice lines and stuff, do you get involved with the actual casting of who gets to voice them and have a say on like, the tone and the enunciation of like the delivery of that character's voice lines?
I have on other games, but Darkest Dungeon actually only has one voiced character, and that's the narrator. But on other games, yep, I've had a little bit of like voice direction involvement. I've never been involved in casting decisions, but that's often because by the time I get brought onto a project, the voices have already been cast. I'm not sure I've ever actually worked on a game where I was involved before all that was set in stone.
I think we've got time for one last question, so we'll just squeeze you in.
No. We'll sneak you in at the end, I promise.
Have you ever made a character that's heavily based on some other character that you saw in different media? And if you did, how do you differentiate your own character to be not rip-off of the character that you based on?
Ooh, that is a really excellent question. It's actually not something that I have a tendency to do, but I think that's mostly just because I like so much stuff and it's all so different that by the time I take a character or a setting or a story element that inspires me and add it into a new genre or a new project, it's already so completely different and twisted that the differentiation kind of emerges organically.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time, Casey. If anyone does have any other questions, I'm sure Casey would be happy to answer them.
I'm happy to just hang out outside if anyone
Yeah,
wants to chat.
absolutely. But can I have one last round of applause, please?